The room was smaller than people imagine. No cameras, no audience. Just a long table, metal chairs, and men in dark suits who didn't smile when John Lennon walked in. It was 1972, New York City. The air outside smelled like exhaust and hot pavement, but inside this building it smelled like old paper and something sharp. Fear, maybe. Or power. John sat down slowly. His hair was longer than theirs. His clothes softer. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a government office. And everyone in the room knew it. One of the men across the table opened a folder. Thick, heavy. The kind of folder that has your name on it before you even know it exists. John didn't ask what was inside. He already knew. They'd been following him for months, maybe longer, watching where he went, who he spoke to, what he said on stage, what he sang about. They wrote it all down. Every word, every appearance, every interview where he talked about the war, about Nixon, about the things most people only whispered about in private. But John didn't whisper, and that was the problem. The man across from him didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just leaned forward slightly, fingers resting on the edge of the folder, and said they had concerns. National security concerns. About his presence, his influence, his visa. John's visa. The thing that let him stay in the country, the thing that kept him with Yoko, the thing that let him make music, perform, speak. It was fragile, temporary, and they wanted him to know it. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He just sat there, hands folded, watching them with eyes that had seen a lot of rooms like this before. Different cities, different accents, same control. Outside that building, the world thought of John Lennon as untouchable. A Beatle, a legend, a voice. But inside that room, he was just a man with an expiring visa and a file full of reasons they could make him leave. They didn't say it directly. They didn't have to. The message was clear. Stop talking. Stop performing at rallies. Stop telling young people to resist. Stop being so loud. Or go home. John left the building that day and walked back into the noise of the city. People passed him on the street without looking twice. No one knew where he'd just been. No one knew what had just been said. But he knew, and he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Because this wasn't about music anymore. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about being right. It was about whether he would let fear make him smaller. The file they showed him that day wouldn't be made public for over 30 years. It would sit in a cabinet somewhere, classified, locked away from journalists and historians, and anyone who wanted to know the truth about what the government did to people who spoke too loud. But in 2006, it finally came out. And when people read it, they realized just how far the surveillance had gone, how deep the fear had been. Not John's fear, theirs. The fear of men in suits who thought one musician with a guitar and a microphone could unravel something they'd spent years building. John's story didn't start in that room, and it didn't end there either. But that moment, sitting across from men who had the power to erase him from the country, that moment was the hinge. The place where everything could have gone a different way. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what brought him there in the first place. John had come to America because it felt like possibility. After the Beatles broke up, after years of being watched and controlled and packaged into something safe, America felt like the one place he could be himself. Messy. Political. Angry when he needed to be. Soft when he wanted to be. He and Yoko moved to New York, and the city folded around them. They went to protests. They recorded music that wasn't trying to be popular. They spoke at rallies about ending the war in Vietnam, about giving young people the vote, about imagining a world that didn't run on violence. And people listened. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that it made certain people nervous. The Nixon administration was watching. They didn't like what they saw. A famous musician with a following, telling young people they had power, telling them the war was wrong, telling them they didn't have to accept what they were being told. And so they opened the file. They started tracking his movements, his appearances, his friendships, his phone calls. They built a case, not a legal one, a political one. They were looking for a reason to remove him, and if they couldn't find one, they'd create the pressure until he removed himself. The deportation battle began quietly. Letters from immigration, delays on his visa renewal, small bureaucratic moves that most people wouldn't notice. But John noticed. He hired lawyers. He fought back. But the fight wasn't equal. They had the law. They had the system. They had files full of things he'd said, things he'd done, things they could twist into evidence of why he didn't belong. And all he had was his voice, which it turned out was the thing they feared most. The man sitting across from John in that small room didn't look afraid. He looked calm, professional, like he was just doing his job. And maybe he believed he was. But fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like control, like the need to silence something before it grows too loud. John understood that. He'd seen it before. In Liverpool, when the authorities didn't like the Beatles playing in certain clubs. In Hamburg, when they were deported for being too loud, too late, too much. In London, when the press turned on him for saying the wrong thing about religion. He'd been here before. But this time was different. This time it wasn't just his career at stake. It was his home, his family, his right to stay in the place he'd chosen to build a life. And the men across from him knew that. They knew he had more to lose now. They knew he wasn't a kid anymore. They knew he had Yoko and Sean and a life that mattered more than any song. And they were counting on that to make him quiet. John left that meeting and went home. He didn't tell Yoko everything, not at first, but she saw it in his face. The weight, the silence. She asked him what he was going to do. He didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't simple. He could stop. He could pull back. He could stop going to rallies, stop speaking out, stop being the version of himself that made people uncomfortable. He could just make music, soft music, safe music, the kind that didn't threaten anyone. And maybe they'd let him stay. Or he could keep going, keep speaking, keep showing up, keep being loud, and risk losing everything. It wasn't a fair choice, but it was the only one he had. For weeks he moved through the city like a man trying to decide who he was going to be. He still went to the studio. He still wrote songs. But there was something different in the air around him. A hesitation, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. His friends noticed. Other activists noticed. They didn't push him. They understood. Everyone understood that the government had found his pressure point. And pressure points are designed to make you fold. But then something happened that no one expected. John went to a small rally. Not a big one, just a gathering in a park. College students, a few speeches, a few songs. Nothing that would make the evening news. He wasn't scheduled to speak. He wasn't even sure he'd stay. But when he got there, he saw the faces. Young, uncertain. Afraid in the same way he'd been afraid sitting in that office. Afraid of being told they didn't matter, that their voices didn't count, that the people in power would always win. And he realized something. If he walked away now, he'd be proving them right. Not the men in suits, the young people in the park. He'd be proving that fear works, that pressure works, that if you squeeze someone hard enough, they'll choose safety over truth. And he couldn't do that. Not because he was brave, not because he had all the answers, but because he knew what it felt like to be silenced, and he knew what it cost. So he stayed. He didn't give a speech. He didn't lead a chant. He just stood there, visible, present, refusing to disappear. And the people in the park saw him, and they understood what it meant. It meant he was still here, still standing, still refusing to be erased. The deportation battle went on for years. It didn't end that day. It didn't end with a dramatic courtroom moment or a sudden change of heart from the government. It ended slowly, painfully, with legal motions and delays and appeals, with John showing up to hearings again and again while his lawyers argued that his presence wasn't a threat, that his music wasn't dangerous, that his voice wasn't something to be feared. And eventually, in 1975, they let him stay. Not because they wanted to, not because they suddenly believed he was harmless, but because he outlasted them. He refused to leave. He refused to be quiet. He refused to let their fear become his fear. And in the end, that was enough. But the file kept growing, even after he won his case, even after he got his green card, even after he stepped back from activism to raise his son, to bake bread, to live a quieter life. They kept watching. They kept writing things down. Because once you're in the file, you don't get out. John didn't know how thick it had gotten. He didn't know how many pages, how many reports, how many notes about where he went, and who he saw, and what he might be planning. He just lived his life. And then, in 1980, he died. Shot outside his apartment by a man who had nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with any of the things John had fought against. Just a man with a gun and a broken mind. And the file became history. For 26 years, it stayed locked, classified. A secret kept by people who believed the public didn't need to know how far they'd gone. But in 2006, after years of legal pressure from historians and journalists, the FBI released it. And the world saw, page after page of surveillance, reports on his concerts, transcripts of his interviews, notes on his friendships, details about his daily life written by agents who followed him, listened to him, built a case against him. Not because he'd committed a crime, but because he'd used his voice. When people read the file, they felt a lot of things. Anger, sadness, shock at how much effort had gone into silencing one man. But there was something else, too. A kind of awe, because the file proved something John had always believed, that the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to be quiet when someone wants you silent. The file was evidence, not of his guilt, but of their fear. They feared him because he made people think, because he made young people question, because he stood in parks and on stages and in small rooms and refused to pretend everything was fine. And they threw everything they had at him. And he stayed. Not perfectly, not without fear, not without moments of doubt and exhaustion and wondering if it was worth it. But he stayed. And that mattered. Because the people watching him, young people trying to figure out if their voices mattered, if resistance was possible, if standing up meant anything, they saw him stay. And it changed what they thought was possible. The file was never supposed to be seen. It was supposed to stay buried. A reminder to future activists that the cost of speaking out was surveillance, pressure, control. But when it came out, it became something else. It became proof that they were afraid, that they had to work that hard to stop one musician with a guitar, that his voice mattered so much they spent years trying to silence it, and in the end, they failed. Not because John was perfect, not because he never struggled, not because he had some special courage the rest of us don't have, but because he understood something simple. That silence is what they want. And the refusal to give it to them, even when you're afraid, even when the cost is high, even when you don't know if it will matter, is the only power any of us really have. The file sits in archives now. Anyone can read it. Researchers, students, people who want to understand what happens when fear tries to control creativity. And every page is a reminder, not of what John lost, but of what he refused to give away.